Good Wednesday, everyone. One thing for sure the war in Ukraine is proving is that really cheap drones are taking out big armor, and specifically made American armor, which is the best in the world. Here's the funny thing about it. I don't think it's that complicated to defeat drones. Uh, for example, I'm sure the U.S. military is looking at all this in shock, thinking to themselves, "Well, that's $100,000 drone that just took out $1 million, or excuse me, a $10 million army tank." Now, granted, most of the armor inside of uh, Ukraine have actually been European armor. Now, to the exception that Biden did deliver quite a bit of Bradley fighting vehicles and Stryker vehicles, and there were some Humvees too. But Humvees is really not what we're talking about. We're talking about Bradleys, Strykers. I don't know where that number is anymore because I don't follow it, but it's over 400 or 500 combined units, right? Um, and they're hugely successful on the battlefield. Okay, but that being said, they've taken their hits too, right? So, how do I personally see the future? Well, my opinion don't matter much, but one, there's already energy weapons in development, have been developed, that could actually just electronically, like an EMP, just bring a drone right out of the sky and crash it. That's a real thing. Now, maybe it would hurt your own systems. I don't know. But here's the thing. I don't think the answer is really all that complicated, nor is it that expensive. You put a security Gatling on top of a future Bradley. They're getting ready to build a new type of Bradley fighting vehicle anyway. But my point is, wherever that future model is, you put a sophisticated tracking radar on it that's attached to a Gatling. And that system basically is not ran by humans. It's automatic. It defends itself automatic. And reason why you put the radar tracking systems on there, and I mean sophisticated, to give soldiers enough time, for example, if they know they're coming under a drone attack, to either get out and run for their lives, or to close the hatchet and get down in there. So we're talking Gatlins and machine guns. Think of the Navy ships Phalanx, for example. These munitions, just like your 22, only except they'd be more obviously than a 22, but the bullets are cheap compared to, say, a $3 million missile. Even if you were measuring it by hundreds of thousands, right? It's cheap, right? And what's a major caliber machine gun bullet's distance? 2 miles, 3 miles capability, probably. So imagine if you built a sophisticated targeting pod that had early warning detection, sophisticated, right? That could strike out 2 or 3 minimally, if nothing else, just short little air burst out at 2 or 3 miles out from where your squad is encamped at. And even if it missed, it's already popping off shots trying to bring down the threat. And those rounds wouldn't probably cost you, the military, or the taxpayer, probably wouldn't even cost $50,000 in ammunition. We think super big. And I like big thinking. However, if the technology isn't there yet, the next natural progression, of course, is laser technology. But my point on that is, if you can't actually produce it to where, one, you have the power that requires to be generated for it to shoot something out of the sky, and secondly, and this is probably the most important thing, if you know much about the laser in form of a weapon, the main problem with lasers is, as they get out further in the distance, they start bending like this. Okay, and they become inaccurate. They start curving and, well, basically just bending. Lasers, once they get out to so many miles, they have a hard time staying in a straight line. Both because, you got the curvature of the world, but also there's just a lot of interference floating around in the atmosphere, right? So it starts falling apart. And so far, that's where scientists have been stumped on the military standpoint, right? They haven't figured out how to take that concept, and say shoot something down. I don't know. I know classified, lightly classified documents have said not much beyond, like, let's say 10 to 15 miles range. So it's not very far. And then the laser falls apart. It's the same problem they have. But if you just took a machine gun bullet, you don't have to worry about, other than just math, the further distance it comes out, it starts losing its energy and diving down. All that can be corrected through very sophisticated targeting pods. That's probably what needs to be happening in the future. Once again, cost effective, save you, the taxpayer, a ton of money, and totally going to keep your troops safe on the battlefield that's going to have drones flying around in the future. One thing that can't actually be an answer is just to say, well, we're not going to build armor because there's drones out there. That can't actually be a thing, because in modern battlefields, there's no possible way you could be fighting wars like they did in World War I, World War II, and even before that, the Spanish-American War. Long gone are the days where you can just put 20,000 guys and say, all right, man, there's the objective, go get it. That's really not been an objection, like a real solution to a problem, since the Gatling gun was created in the 1800s. So, and obviously they're much improved upon today, but even in the 1800s, if you were Custer or Robert E. Lee or anybody in the Civil War in that time frame, right? If your army was traveling with, 10 hand crankers, they had the old crankers back then, but even back then, those suckers were spitting out like 100 rounds per minute or something, which was just absolutely unheard of, right? So even back then, it was a game changer, right? So, and obviously they're much more approved between the Browning and the Gatlins and what have it. To me, that seems to be the near future cost-effective fix. Does that make your armor vehicle more expensive? Yeah, but like I said, it's not even possible in the modern sense to send your Marines and your Army infantry and Marine infantry and Army infantry across a wide open battlefield not protected by armor. By the way, that's not even new news, right? This was painfully obvious even as far back as World War II, and some of the even going back to World War I, when they started to introduce the first real shitty tanks. But there again, it was very clear just in that brief period of time that tanks were showing up on the World War II or World War I battlefields, that if infantrymen just hid behind the tanks, no matter how goofy and slow and awkward they were, those guys standing back there were not getting killed. And they could walk right up to a trench and just jump down the trench and shoot you, or immediately hand-to-hand combat would take place. And in World War II, it became more refined. Matter of fact, part of the German Blitzkrieg actually used combined arms, right? It used a very sophisticated infantry tank movement together, where you'd have a pattern, usually, say, of somewhere between like 5 or 6 tanks, and they would be spaced so many points. Obviously, we're still spacing stuff all these years later, but they'd be spaced, and then behind them in those spaces would be like, I don't know, say 200 to 1,000 infantrymen, and they would be spaced out behind them, and it would just push forward. And then once we saw, so that was obviously very successful, right? It conquered a lot, and everyone used it, including Patton, once they learned how Germany was deploying it. But what I'm saying is, as time even progressed in the later years of World War I, or II, excuse me, when this whole idea of mechanized infantry became a thing, right? Germany, specifically Germany and America, because they're the only ones that had the industrialization to produce them, you eventually started getting into these things where not only were the Panthers using their blitzkrieg strategies and artillery and air power and all that, but then you actually had, towards the back half of the war, they were producing actually armored fighting vehicles that might be able to hold, say, 5 or 6 guys inside of them. And so now suddenly, okay, Germany was all about speed and blitzing. They had, the best tanks, right? But now imagine the weakness to the strategy they had back then was, one, they had really expensive tanks that were better than everyone's. But secondly, they couldn't, unless they were engaged in literally an armored battle, they could never really just speed out into the opening and leave the infantry standing wide open in the field. In other words, they could only move as fast as the infantry could travel. But once you had infantry fighting vehicles created, which kind of came towards the back half of World War II, now all of a sudden you could have an entire armored column, moving, say, 30-40 miles per hour towards a target, faster than any human being could run in a dead sprint, especially with their, rucksacks and stuff. And this became a thing. And then, of course, in the years after, obviously it wasn't much of a thing in Vietnam because it was jungle, right? That was hell, man. Korea was even before Vietnam, and Korea was a lot of the same thing. At that point, it was still very World War II-like, where you just had guys standing on a chuck wagon, marching with your tanks, and then they were just literally marching, just like the Romans or something, unless they had machine guns, right? So, but it started to appear, and we've never looked back, and it's never been anything that's changed, because, like I said, in modern warfare, unless you end up, say, in Brazil, where you have a rainforest type situation, you just can't have troops running across open cornfields or anything really that doesn't have a natural barrier to it. And the only thing us humans have invented, that would save lives to achieve objectives, is armor. Armor's the only thing that protects them. Both the vest that you wear, your combat vest, your helmet, but literally physical armor that's, 60 inches wide or something like that, right? To protect you. So, anyway, in the video, we're learning a lot from Ukraine, even though we're not doing anything specifically there. And I know there's a lot of generals freaking out. And I also know there's a lot of generals that are like, well, we can't keep buying Bradley fighting vehicles if a $800 drone's going to wipe it out with an anti-tank round. Okay, and I get it, that's probably true, but at the same time, you can't actually conduct a war without mechanized infantry in modern warfare. It's really not possible. It would probably be possible, say, maybe in urban warfare, but you ask any dude who's been in live combat in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last few years, even going back to Mogadishu, right, years ago in the 90s, I guarantee you, even other than when it comes to clearing buildings, I guarantee you all of them will tell you they would rather be in the back of an armored vehicle instead of walking in the open down, streets that are not familiar to them, with possible every window and possibly every corner an ambush point. In other words, they'd probably die a lot easier. They statistically will die easier. They would all rather be protected behind a wall of armor. So, I don't know what the future's going to be. I'm not Nostradamus. But it's just a thought I had. And once again, if you like the video, guys, we're just having conversation. We're just picking our brains here, man. If you like it, give it a like, subscribe, and, I don't know, leave comments say something in the comments. That's all I'm trying to say, guys. We like talking, man. We like having conversation. This isn't me trying to be a smart ass. This isn't me being a know-it-all. I do know a lot of stuff, particularly military, but it's not about me being a know-it-all. I'm just throwing out ideas. So if you think about things and you just trying to have a good conversation pertaining to the conversation in the video, or the topic of the video, then give me a jingle, baby. Let's talk, man. We'll like I said, I'm pretty active in the comment box, so there you go, guys. Anyway, talk to you all later. Enjoy your Wednesday. We're halfway through the work week. That's always a good thing. Talk to you later. Bye.